Welcome back to Straightforward, Levant TV's political debate show looking into the Middle East top issues and assessing them objectively by having guests representing all views. Today's topic is the Kerry Initiative and the alternative route to pursuing Israeli-Palestinian peace talks vis-à-vis the Fatah-Hamas rapprochement. With me at the studio this evening is UK-based activist and blogger Maysoon Rice. Thank you very much for being on Straightforward. And also with me is Dr. Simon Waldman, lecturer in Middle East politics at King's College London. Thank you very much for coming. We will be joined later by the phone by Dr. Imad Karam, head of IR at Initiatives Change UK, and Dr. Toby Green, director of research at BICOM Britain Israel Communications and Research Centre, and by SOAS lecturer and journalist Jonathan Fryer. But before we start our first part on US brokered peace efforts, let's have a bit of background through this brief report. Last March the 10th, the Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas gave a speech broadcast on state TV to the 120 members of Fatah's Revolutionary Council. Abbas devoted about half of his 2-hour speech to accusations against Mohammed Dahlan, the former head of the Palestinian Authority Preventive Security Service in the Gaza Strip. Abbas accused Dahlan of corruption, assassinations, and treasonous collaboration with Israel. Abbas even hinted that Dahlan may have played a role in the death of Yasser Arafat. The Abbas-Dahlan dispute highlights the chaos and bitter succession crisis in Fatah, and it threatens to further deteriorate the movement's public image and alienate Palestinian public opinion. The escalating dispute has led to what appears to be a bitter succession crisis. Fatah has had plenty of factional disputes in the past, but the current one has been the most damaging given its timing and the high profile of the parties involved. Fatah is scheduled to hold its 7th General Conference in August to select a new leadership, but fragmentation at both the leadership and grassroots levels threatens to make the coming month increasingly turbulent. The movement's predicament is bound to intensify in the coming weeks now that there is a deadlock in the Israeli-Palestinian peace talks. It appears that Hamas has begun a tentative rapprochement with Dahlan to reduce the siege on Gaza from the Egyptian side, as Dahlan is considered close to the military regime in Egypt. Dahlan is said to have influence in Palestinian refugee camps and Jordan and Lebanon, and among the governments of the United Arab Emirates. There have been reports of meetings between Field Marshal Abdel Fattah al-Sisi and Dahlan, with Sisi attempting to facilitate Dahlan's readmission into Fatah. But how important are the Abbas-Mishal talks in Doha, and would they be a roadmap that would strengthen the Palestinian Authority? And now let's talk to Jonathan Fryer, journalist and lecturer at SOAS. Thank you very much for being on Straightforward.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Jonathan, could we relate the Doha talks between Khalid Mishal and President Mahmoud Abbas to what is happening in Egypt? There have been reports of meetings between presidential candidate Field Marshal Abdel Fattah al-Sisi and Mohammed Dahlan, for instance, the former head of the Palestinian Authority Preventive Security Service in the Gaza Strip. He met with Sisi attempting to facilitate his readmission into Fatah. So do you relate these events?
Well, I think they're all part of a quite interesting, almost ballet that's happening in the Middle East and the region at the moment, consequent on the decision by Fatah and Hamas to come together. And obviously, although that has put the wind up the Israelis, nonetheless, it's caused other partners in the region, including the Qataris and the Egyptians and others, to see that actually things are possibly moving in an interesting direction, and they want to be involved.
Yes. And my other question, Jonathan Fryer, would be, what do you have to say about the Kerry Initiative, and why do you think it didn't really yield its desired objectives?
Well, obviously the main problem there was that they didn't have in the Israelis a partner who was really able and willing to make sufficient step forward. That's why John Kerry was so frustrated about the outcome, of course, and why the European countries, including Britain, have been, for the main part, expressing deep disappointment. And it was interesting that, for example, at the meeting of the European Liberal parties in Vienna the other day, a motion was passed which basically was saying Israel needs to get back to talks with the Palestinians, because the longer it goes on, the longer the difficulty goes on, the longer settlements are built, then the further away peace will be.
Mm-hmm. Do you think a stop in expansion when it comes to the settlements, particularly in the West Bank, would help any possible peace talks in the near future if Israel decided to stop settlements?
It would certainly help. I think it's a tragic miscalculation by Benjamin Netanyahu not to have halted the settlements already, despite being urged to do so not only by the Europeans but by President Barack Obama as well. I think the Americans are starting to lose a little patience with the Israelis, understandably and correctly, and the only way really that the Israelis could regain a little initiative would be to stop the settlements, but alas, there has been no sign whatsoever. They're still announcing new settlements.
What do you think of John Kerry's phraseology when he mentioned Israel risks becoming an apartheid state?
I think he was very brave to say it, and when he
Why
wasn't
so?
talking about the risk of apartheid, because in the American context, given the strength of the pro-Israeli lobby in America, it's a very brave thing to say. Unfortunately, he then had to retract it, or felt he had to retract it, which was a shame, because it was a good, really an attempt to get the American public, as well as the Israelis themselves, to understand the dangers that they're heading towards.
Thank you very much. That was Jonathan Fryer, journalist and lecturer at SOAS in London. Thank you very much indeed for your prompt participation.
Thank you.
And now I will ask Dr. Waldman, in your opinion, could the talks between President Abbas and Fatah leader Khalid Mish'al pave the way to a roadmap that the Palestinian leadership could take now that the Kerry Initiative did not really yield too much?
Well, I mean, that is the big question at the moment. From what's happened in the past and previous agreements, one should not be too optimistic. What's interesting about the idea of a kind of a reconciliation in Palestinian politics is this is very popular. If you ask a Palestinian what they want, probably number one would be an end of the occupation. Probably number two would be some kind of unity within the Palestinian factions. And the lack of unity is one of the problems which has plagued the Palestinian population, you know, right
maybe
from the
Arab
1920s.
Population in general.
You could even say perhaps the Arab population in general. This particular one, it's interesting in that how does it relate to the peace process? How does it work on the ground? Well, I'm yet to see really the nitty-gritty of the terms come out, but it seems to be along the lines of creating some kind of interim technocratic government to really caretake for 6 months until elections come out. So I think the real question is, if this is successful, what would be the outcome of elections? And from there we can analyze what future for the peace process. But this is of course a big if. I mean, you know, some of the major points have not yet been addressed, such as security details in both the West Bank and Gaza. Will there be security cooperation? Who is going to be on this technocratic government? And some of these questions are really pivotal and have made previous agreements fall and fail.
I would like to ask you, Dr. Waldman, while Israel is seen from the Palestinian side as a non-compromising state when it comes to the peace talks, some argue that it is the lack of unity between the Palestinians that stands in the way in devising a clear agenda for peace. What can you say about that?
It's certainly a case. If you want to look at why the peace talks were unsuccessful, I think you have two sides here. You have the problems with the Israelis, which I can talk about in a few minutes, and also within the Palestinian as well. The problem with the Palestinians is the question of, okay, even if an agreement is actually signed and made and there's going to be a Palestinian state, well, how is it going to be implemented when there's a division among the Palestinians? And this division is not just about the peace process, it's also about governing territory. How can a territory be governed effectively if it's divided? And this is a significant problem, a significant obstacle which has to be overcome. Now, in terms of the Israeli side, if I may, if you want to look at the reasons why the Israelis were unable to really kind of freeze completely settlement construction while it was taking place. Two things I think which are important. One is the question of politics, Israeli domestic politics.
We'll get to that in the next section.
I'm talking about, and the other thing that I think is really important then is the security argument with Israel. Yes, in terms of opinion polls, the majority of Israelis do support a two-state solution. By the way, the majority do not think it's possible to achieve, which is something different.
What is possible in their eyes? Just the state of Israel?
Well, yes. I mean,
okay.
would it actually be signed? Would there be another shaking of hands in the White House lawn? Not necessarily.
Very skeptical.
But what's happened in Israel, I think, is that the security argument for land for peace has been lost. If you look at the 1990s, in fact, even if you go even further back to, the Sadat and the Begin agreement, there was a security argument on the case of Israel that there needs to be land for peace, and then later there needs to be a Palestinian state in order to maximize Israeli security. That is not the argument that's winning the day anymore. Instead, there is a barrier which is part wall, part fence, which is providing a certain amount of Israeli security.
Can we clarify, sorry to interrupt, on security? You mentioned a lot of security as a top priority, be it in the polls or anywhere. Now, security as in a country which is in the Arab world, or security with Iran being not too far, especially now with its nuclear aspirations that are supposedly kept at bay, or is it security from the Palestinians who are not as equally armed as Israel? So can you clarify a little bit the security concern when it comes to Israel?
I think that's a fantastic question, actually, because the answer is all of the above. If you want to understand not just Israeli policy towards the Palestinians, but also Israeli foreign policy in general, you look at what Israel's primary security issues are vis-a-vis the Palestinians, and then what you will see in terms of foreign policy is an extension of that immediate short-term security policy, then with its neighboring states. And what Israelis want is essentially normality. They want, a life free of terrorist attacks and the potential for terrorist attacks. And, in order to do that, which is something very tricky, they rely upon themselves. So it's Israeli reliance on their own methods in order to achieve that security. Again, you can like that, you can dislike it, but that is still an Israeli priority. And it comes up again and again in talks. With the exception of, say, East Jerusalem, what else is being discussed in terms of borders, boundaries? You'll see the security argument being there. And the security argument also comes from a mistrust of the Palestinian ability to engage in security-related issues themselves.
Maysoon Rice, Dr. Waldman spoke about the lack of unity within the Palestinian Authority. We know very well, on the other hand, that the Israeli lobby is way more influential than the Palestinian one that lacks tangible Arab support even. Now, what are the chances nowadays of having a Palestinian state that has Jerusalem as its capital? Is it still realistic for you as a Palestinian, or is a two-state option more feasible?
I don't believe in a two-state solution. I don't think we will ever get our Palestinian state, because not under Israeli orders anyway, because what they want is not what Palestinians want at all. And I repeat that we will not be allowed any control over our borders. We will not, the Israelis will control our airspace, they will control the sea, everything. So this is, and I think my biggest argument is, why should Palestinians create a Palestinian state? We already had a state which was usurped from Palestine, from ancient Palestine, first by all the colonialists that we've had ruling Palestine throughout history, and then by the British, and then with the arrival of the European immigrants, etc., and the settlers, etc. Every time They talk about peace. They keep saying, oh, well, we'll release so many, Palestinian prisoners. This follows with each peace agreement. These peace agreements are just absolute rubbish. Every time Israel agrees to release 80 prisoners, 100 prisoners, she ends up arresting 200 more prisoners. Or she ends up rearresting the prisoners that she agreed to let out in the first place. No, there will never be a two-state solution because it will not be equal. It will be a Palestinian puppet under Israeli hegemony.
Do you agree, Dr. Waldman?
I mean, some of the things which you say, I have to say that I don't quite agree. So, for example, there was never a Palestinian state, ever. Because if you go before the British, it was under Ottoman rule. It was under Ottoman rule for many, many centuries. So there's never an independent Palestinian state. And by the way, what's very interesting, if any of your watchers are into history, if you look at Zionist-Arab dialogue in Palestine, just ahead of World War I, there's a slight window of opportunity where perhaps there could have been some kind of reconciliation between Zionists and Palestinian Arabs, which is a very interesting period of history. But in terms of there'll never be a Palestinian state and that kind of attitude, well, perhaps not. If one is not going to look at the two-state solution as the answer, then I don't think there will be a Palestinian state. And if you want proof of it, make a visit to Tel Aviv. Talk to the people there.
What do they say?
Israelis are not going anywhere. It's a developed, highly developed society. It's a high-tech, booming economy. I'm afraid they're not going to just fold up and leave. And you may like that, you may hate that, but that is, in fact, the reality. Now, is it possible for a Palestinian state to emerge? Yes, it is possible, but it will have to be a smaller Palestinian state. It will not be over the territory of what was Mandate Palestine under the British. And that may be a tragedy for many people, but that is...
Is this fair, though? Like you said, it could be a tragedy. So.
Politics is not about what's fair, unfortunately. It's about what's feasible, what's real. And if that's something that the majority of the Palestinian people can't accept, they have to ask themselves, is the continuation of the status quo any better? Perhaps not. In terms of, what would the Palestinian state look like? Would it be a state with no army? Would it be a state with not in control of its borders, of its maritime borders in the case of Gaza? There are possible ways where that could be alleviated. Say an agreement is made, a two-state solution becomes a reality, and there's a declaration of Palestinian statehood, which is actually real and not just a declaration, then initially, no, the Palestinians will have a state which is different than many other states in that they will not have an army. That would never be agreed to. However, over a decade, 2 decades, after confidence has increased between the parties, that could be something possible.
Do you agree with this rhetoric that there should...
First of all, Palestine has always existed. It has existed since biblical times.
I didn't say it didn't exist.
It
as a
existed.
state, as an independent state.
It existed as a country. It was known as Canaan. It was renamed by the Greek colonialists who called it Palestina. But it was always the land of Canaan. My ancestors are Canaanites. We were there long before the Hebrew tribe arrived with Joshua.
I mean, I'm sorry, I don't believe in biblical stories.
Yes.
I believe in archaeological facts.
You may not,
so
but
I don't,
you may not, but the fellow Israelis base this. They keep giving me their religious argument that they have some kind of biblical link to the Holy Land. When you consider that the vast majority of those squatters, those settlers sitting in my father's homeland are what we call Ashkenazi Jews. I'm not being disrespectful to Jewish people. But the majority of the Jews who are squatting in ancient Palestine have no genetic historical roots to the Holy Land. Even the Israeli historian Shlomo Sands has pointed this out in his book, as have other historians.
I'm afraid this is just something I'm not interested in. And it's simply because I think the real question emerges from the rise of modern nationalism in the 19th century. If you look at any single country in the map and human population, you see waves of migrants from different regions, and you're talking about a period of, 10,000 years, but there's so many different migrants.
But maybe Mrs. Rice meant they coexist more than they do in what is now.
Well, I mean, if you want to talk about coexistence, I would rather live, and I don't live there, but I would rather live in Israel, Palestine of the present than I would under the Canaanite period, where you have all kinds of massacres and genocides and all kinds of things. So, I mean, it's just not based on fact, it's just mythical.
I wouldn't live under present Israel. Israel has committed genocide against my people. And in fact, I will go so far as to, I would dare use the word Holocaust against my people.
Look,
and if you, when you define the Greek word of Holocaust, which the Jewish people do not have a monopoly over, we had nothing to do with the Holocaust, nothing whatsoever.
As Palestinian people.
As Palestinian people. We were not involved in this European world war, which in itself, the whole of World War II was one big Holocaust where millions of people died. Not just Jewish people. I don't deny that Jewish people died under the Nazis, but that wasn't my fault. That wasn't the fault of my father. That wasn't the fault of my grandfather. We had nothing to do with it. But these Ashkenazi Jews who are settling in my homeland, you see, you may not be interested in the biblical link, but they're always bringing it up. They're always bringing it up. And you're always talking about polls, the poll of this and poll of that. 82% of Israelis want the ethnic cleansing of Arabs. And the Palestinian state that you talk about, that the Israelis want for Palestinians, is either in Jordan, just because the majority of the people in Jordan at the moment happen to be Palestinians. And there was also an idea bounded about by some, I think it was a rabbi, that why not transfer Palestinians into the Negev desert and make that a Palestinian state. This is from Israeli sources, not from my sources.
Let me just respond to this. First of all, I never mentioned polls, so I'm not going to really discuss that. In terms of some of the other things you said, I'm afraid you're mixing dates. In terms of certain things that Rabbi said, we're not talking about necessarily the present day right now. What is being discussed, which is kind of similar to that, is Lieberman's proposal about the future Palestinian state incorporating the triangle area that's south of Haifa. But that's something a little bit different. Look, in terms of Holocaust, no, Jewish people do not have the monopoly of the word Holocaust. So the word Holocaust means wipe out, the wipe out of an entire people. I beg to differ in terms of calling what happened to the Palestinians a Holocaust. I think the term al-Nakba is an accurate description of what happened to the Palestinian people. But in terms of the way you're describing what's happened to the Palestinians under occupation, and in terms of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails, if you want to see a genocide, if you want to see the remnants of genocide, if you want to see the remnants of torture, of sodomization in jails, go to the Red House in Suleimani in northern Iraq in Kurdistan, and then you will see a systematic, planned, modern-day Holocaust against the people in the Middle East. This is not comparable to what's happening to the Palestinians right now. Not saying that what's occurring in Palestine isn't a tragedy. It is a tragedy, but it's not helpful to use some of the terminology that you're using. In terms of cases of sodomization and torture in Israeli jails, for example, please read human rights reports.
I have read
human rights
and
reports
that's what I base
elsewhere.
I base it on human rights reports. I base it on Palestinian human rights reports. These are the people who will tell you that my people in Israeli jails are being tortured by Israelis. Our children are being sodomized. Our women are being raped. So please don't try and deny this. This is what the... And a Holocaust does not mean wipe out. It means in Greek it means massive death and destruction or great loss of life.
Thanks.
Especially through fire.
Thanks for the clarification. And now we are joined by Dr. Imad Karam, head of the International Relations Initiative in the UK, and he's originally from Gaza. Welcome on Straightforward.
Thank you.
Dr. Karam, could we relate the Doha talks between Khalid Mish'al and President Abbas to what is happening in Egypt, especially now as Abdel Fattah Sisi is hopeful for president?
Well, thank you for having me on the show, Carl.
You're welcome.
What it looks to me, the case is that with the failure of the peace talks between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, and with the signed agreement between Hamas and Fatah, and with the possibility of Sisi coming to power as president soon in Egypt, is that Egypt and the Palestinians are looking for an exit, a way forward, whereby Abbas can get his seat back in Gaza, where Hamas can have an exit and return to some form of relationship with Egypt, and where Sisi could claim that he's for the Palestinian cause while continuing to probably keep the pressure on the Muslim Brotherhood and on Hamas, as long as Hamas is within the Palestinian house. So some sort of something in that direction. It looks like what's being planned or cooked here.
Dr. Karam, one question. Where do you see this going now after the rapprochement between Fatah and Abbas?
Certainly there seems to be more hope this time, but one has to be quite cautious. This is not the first attempt, but it has been 7-8 years of Palestinian division. What could give a sense of hope for those who would like to see a Palestinian unity and reconciliation is that this time both parties are weak and need each other, and this is one of the main reasons where, if it does succeed, despite the huge obstacles lying ahead, not least Israel's objection and the United States objection to it, and internal. The details are still difficult to hammer out, but there is I would say, in my view, there is a glimpse of hope this time that it could become a reality.
And Dr. Karam, what do you think of the Israeli reaction when it comes to this rapprochement between Fatah and Hamas? Why was there a lot of anger? We saw a lot of anger.
Indeed, it's difficult to understand. At a level when any common sense would think that there could never be peace between Israel and Palestine without having all Palestinians and all Israelis as part of the deal, where this could be an opportunity to bring Hamas on board. It always puzzles me the Israeli reaction that is no to Hamas rather than yes to unity with the conditions. Nobody is expecting Israel just to be happy with it, but at least to give peace a chance and to say welcome on board Hamas if you would like to be part of the peace process, rather than we can't have this and we wouldn't have this, and react in the way they do. I sometimes wonder whether it's just it's only in Israel's interest not to have peace talks at this point, and by that I mean the Israeli leadership who looked like stuck and wanted a way out of peace talks.
Stay with us, Imad. Let's see what Dr. Waldman has to say about that. Why did Israel not embrace this rapprochement between Fatah and Hamas?
Well, yeah, I mean, for the most part, I agree with Dr. Karam's analysis there. I think it's quite accurate. And the reason why Israel didn't embrace the rapprochement is they see any kind of association with Hamas as one, as a terrorist organization, and as two, a setback for the peace process. And that's why there's certain conditions that Israel, together with the international community, have put on any kind of dealing with Hamas.
What if Hamas rebranded? You mentioned terrorism. What if they were willing to rebrand and they show signs of that?
I mean, don't get me wrong. In terms of Hamas and the two-state solution, at one point, Hamas needs to be brought into the equation. They can't be left out of it. The question is when and on what terms, what conditions. In terms of a rebranding of Hamas, if Hamas were to go the way of the PLO did in the 1980s, then there shouldn't be an objection to it, and the international community should put pressure on Israel to actually, seize the opportunity. And there have been some signs of this, almost a couple of steps forward and a couple of steps back, clarifications that actually, perhaps Hamas hasn't been as forward-thinking in terms of rebranding itself every time there's ideas and possibilities that it has. So that would be a different kettle of fish if Hamas were to rebrand and accept the two-state solution, or to abandon arms and weapons.
What do you think of Hamas? Will they be able to rebrand and get into the equation like Dr. Waldman was saying?
I think they have already rebranded to an extent, maybe not to the satisfaction of Israel and the United States. I think Hamas needs to be given the chance. Hamas, any wise politician who is working behind the scene would know that Hamas cannot in public just rebrand and say, yes, tomorrow, welcome to peace. The real deal is to have a comprehensive peace deal that all Palestinians can subscribe to. And at that point, when Hamas will be with or behind, or will come to the public and say, this is the final solution we are party to, what doesn't help peace is to actually say to Hamas to change first and then come to the negotiations. History tells us as Palestinians that Arafat made that mistake. Arafat should not have, in my personal opinion, recognized the state of Israel in the first place, outside a final peace deal. It's an occupier and occupied. It's two parties. Each one is looking at the other as the enemy. Everything is sorted out, is sorted on the table, unconditionally. We cannot, I am with asking Hamas to denounce violence, but to be expecting Hamas to change everything inside out, I don't think it's practical or will bring peace sooner. And the minute Hamas changes, there will be the next one in line, Islamic Jihad or any other faction. What's really key here, if diplomacy is to work quietly on a comprehensive peace deal that the Palestinians will find unity to get behind, and where the Israelis will have the same. And that's the only way forward for a final peace. Otherwise, it's only a cycle.
Maysoon Bryce, do you agree with Dr. Karam completely, or do you have any remarks?
No, I would like to give you a quote by the late Edward Said, who commented on the Oslo Accord, which he accused Arafat of capitulation, and I agree with him wholeheartedly. It was an agreement by its real name, an instrument of Palestinian surrender, indeed a Palestinian Versailles. It truly amazes me how the Israelis always talk about Hamas being a terrorist organization, and yet when you look into the history of the creation of the State of Israel, leading up from the 1920s right up to its recognition by the United Nations, the Israeli state was created through terrorism. You had the Irgun, you had the Haganah. These were terrorist organizations, and they were recognized as such by the British mandate. And these Irgun and so on, terrorists, it's amazing how the vast majority of Israeli prime ministers and presidents were all ex-members of terrorist organizations. The Stern Gang, the Irgun, you had Shamir, you had Rabin, you had Menachem Begin, Golda Meir, even Zippy Livni's father was a member of the Irgun terrorist gang. So I really don't think we Palestinians need to be lectured about terrorism. I don't have any faith in Abbas.
Respect your opinion, of course.
This is my personal opinion. And you'll find that my opinions are shared by many Palestinians, especially in refugee camps. I went to visit a couple of refugee camps in Beirut, and I gauged the opinions of many of them. You see, the problem with we Palestinians, we are our worst enemy. Our Achilles heel is our disunity. And it's only when we unite, that's where we will gain our strength, and that's when the Israeli entity will find a formidable force to deal with.
Dr. Imad Karam, thank you very much for joining us again, Head of International Relations Initiative UK, originally from Gaza. Thank you very much for being on Straightforward.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And now let's move to our next section, where we will look at the US brokered peace talks that did not attain their desired objectives. We also look at signs that could pave the way for the road ahead at the level of the Palestinian leadership. But before, let's have a look at this brief report.
More than a year after Palestine was upgraded to become a non-member observer state of the United Nations, the attributes of statehood exist mainly on official Palestinian letterhead. But now, with the collapse of the American brokered Middle East negotiations, the Palestinian leadership is focusing on its diplomatic and legal struggle for international recognition of Palestine as a state under occupation, and for Israel to be held accountable as the occupier. April witnessed a move that angered Israel and Washington when Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas signed applications to join 15 international treaties and conventions after Israel missed a deadline for releasing Palestinian prisoners. In the absence of negotiations, the Palestinians plan to proceed cautiously as they join more than 40 other treaties and agencies, culminating in an application to join the International Criminal Court in The Hague. This could result in prosecution for Israel for its policy of settlement buildings in West Bank and East Jerusalem. On the other hand, experts say a Palestinian state could potentially be held responsible for every rocket fired into Israeli civilian areas by militants in Gaza. By joining the ICC and coming under its jurisdiction, the Palestinians could open themselves to potential investigations requested by pro-Israeli NGOs or the UN Security Council, even if Israel itself is not a member.
And from Jerusalem, we are now joined by Dr. Toby Green, Director of Research at BICOM Britain Israel Communication and Research Centre. Thank you very much for joining Straightforward.
Good evening, thank you.
Dr. Green, as per the Guardian newspaper, polls show that more than 80% of American Jews back US leadership toward a two-state solution. Why do you think the percentage is relatively high this time?
Well, I don't find that percentage particularly surprising. I'm not sure there's anything really new about that. I think most Jews in the United States and most Jews in Britain, and indeed most Jews in Israel, support a two-state solution. Certainly in Israel, that's been a pretty consistent statistic for the last decade. About 2/3 of Israeli Jews are in favor of a two-state solution. So I don't think there's anything very surprising about that. And although US diplomatic efforts to bring about a two-state solution have not been particularly fruitful in the last 5 years, I think that most Jews around the world, certainly in the United States and in Israel, want to continue the effort to find a negotiated agreement. So I don't think there's anything very surprising about that statistic.
And also the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC, were quite enthusiastic when it comes to John Kerry's peace initiative, assuming it could send a powerful message. But despite Kerry himself calling his initiative, quote, a great constituency for peace, why, in your opinion, did the initiative not end up being a game changer despite the momentum it gained in the US particularly?
Well, I don't think that American public opinion is really the critical factor here. I think the key factors relate to political realities in Israeli and Palestinian societies. Unfortunately, there remain very real gaps between the parties on the key final status issues, and it's proven very difficult to narrow those gaps. And also on the Palestinian side, there seems to be a sense that they have an alternative to reaching a negotiated agreement, which is to try and pursue their interests through gaining membership of international organizations and treaties, and using those organizations as a base to diplomatically isolate Israel. And that is a strategy they seem to prefer to negotiating directly with Israel. They had to be dragged into this negotiation process, and they seem quite keen to divert from it back into their program to internationalize the conflict. So I think that's one of the many factors that have led to the failure of this process. There are others as well, but I think it is really about Israeli and Palestinian peoples and Israeli and Palestinian societies that are determining and will determine the success and failure of ongoing efforts to reach a negotiated agreement.
There has been outrage on the Israeli political right, including some in Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's own Likud party, who oppose any Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank, while a clear majority in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, somewhat backs a two-state solution, like you said before. Would there be a consensus anytime soon within the Knesset when it comes to that?
Well, you're right to say, as I mentioned, that a majority of Israelis are in favor of a two-state solution. It is also true to say that there is a very strong opposition to that from a minority on the Israeli right. My sense is that that were an agreement to be reached, that a clear majority of Israelis would back it. There are polls that show that if Prime Minister Netanyahu were to bring an agreement to a referendum in Israel, it would pass by a 2-to-1 margin, a very convincing margin indeed. And in fact, if we look back historically at occasions in the past when Israeli leaders have made or proposed territorial concessions, they have been backed by a majority of Israelis, and that majority and the majority support for those concessions has been successful in overcoming the opposition, albeit very strongly felt opposition, of those opposed to those concessions on the right. If we look at the most recent significant example, which was Israel's unilateral withdrawal from the Gaza Strip and 4 small settlements in the northern West Bank in 2005, even in the absence of an agreement with the Palestinians, when an Israeli leader came to the Israeli public and said it's in Israel's interests to make this territorial concession, however difficult and painful and divisive it may be for us, a majority of Israelis went along with that and supported that. And even though there was very strong and very active opposition from opponents to that concession within Israeli society, the majority did prevail. So I do believe that in a future an agreement, were an Israeli leader to come with a proposal that was convincing to the Israeli public, that said this is in our interests, I believe that a majority would go along with it, and I believe the majority would prevail.
Let us talk to Mrs. Rice here at the studio.
As far as I'm concerned, as a human being who is half Palestinian, the only people who have made any concessions have been the Palestinians. And then secondly, you talk about Palestinians making movements with the United Nations to be recognized by international states. You're fearing that the Palestinians are going to somehow isolate Israel. I mean, that is a joke, really.
Dr. Green, would you be able to reply just briefly? And I will have a last question after you'd reply to Mrs. Rice.
Well, Carl, your question was about Israel was capable of building a consensus around the concessions necessary to make a peace agreement possible. And as I suggested to you, I think Israel is capable of that in the right conditions. And I think that Israel has demonstrated that in the past. I think that there is perhaps an even bigger question mark over Palestinian society and whether the Palestinians are capable of coalescing around the kinds of concessions necessary for a peace agreement. The Palestinians are deeply divided. The 2 main factions, Fatah and Hamas, though they've announced recently a unity agreement, have for the last 6 or 7 years been deeply divided, both ideologically and politically, have not been able to coalesce around a platform based on a 2-state solution, have had very different programs for what Palestinian national interests should be and how they should be advanced. So I think if we reverse the question, I think there is perhaps an even bigger question really over whether the Palestinians are ready and able to unite around the kinds of concessions and compromises that will be necessary to make a peace agreement possible.
And my last question, Dr. Green, how would you comment on US Secretary of State John Kerry using the term apartheid in his statement when he said if the peace talks fail, then Israel risks becoming an apartheid state?
Well, I think it's very important to understand exactly what John Kerry was saying and look at his words carefully. He was not calling Israel an apartheid state. He was saying that there's no alternative to a two-state solution, because any one-state alternative would either be an Arab majority state that are no longer a Jewish state, or it would be a state in which, like an apartheid state, in which a Jewish minority would have rights over a Palestinian majority. And that warning is not new. That's a warning that a number of Israeli politicians have also made. And most Israelis have internalized that problem. And indeed, that's one of the reasons why most Israelis would like to see a two-state solution. They don't want to live in an apartheid state. They want to live in a democratic state with a Jewish majority. That's why they support a two-state solution. Unfortunately, that's only one of the problems that Israel is wrestling with. On the one hand, Israelis want to see a negotiated two-state agreement because they want to live in a democratic state with a Jewish majority. On the other hand, they do not want territory that they evacuate in the West Bank to become another base for Iranian-backed armed groups to attack Israel. That's what happened when Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip in 2005, and that's what happened when Israel withdrew from South Lebanon in 2000. Now Israel has Hezbollah backed by Iran on its northern border and Hamas backed by Iran on its southern border. It doesn't want to see that situation recreated in the West Bank. So it's these two challenges that Israel is wrestling with. That is why security issues and security concerns are so paramount on the Israeli side when it comes to negotiating the terms for a two-state agreement.
Dr. Toby Green, Director of Research at BICOM's Israel office, also holding a first-class honours degree in Philosophy and Theology from the University of Cambridge, Head of Policy and Research for Labour Friends of Israel. Thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Waldman, how can you assess the framework of the Kerry Initiative in terms of the establishment of a Palestinian state on the vast majority of the West Bank, its eastern border will be the Jordan River and its western border will be based on the pre-1967 line, which was drawn between Israel and Jordan?
Well, I mean, this has been part of the discussions, the ongoing discussions, and one of the major elements of why the recent peace talks have fallen through was on the question of territory. Okay, we're talking about a Palestinian state, but on what borders exactly? What would the borders of the Palestinian state be, and what and who, more importantly, are going to be in charge of security, especially on the eastern borders of the Palestinian state, along the River Jordan. And you know, we've kind of gathered from different leaks that the Israelis wanted to have an Israeli security presence on this border. And some of the other ideas that were being floating around was that there'll be a US presence or perhaps a NATO presence. In terms of, you know, what percentage of the West Bank and Gaza Strip would become a Palestinian state, there were all kinds of different, you know, suggestions and counter-suggestions being put forward. It seemed as if the Israelis were willing to concede 90% of the West Bank to a Palestinian state, with different territorial swaps. But that was not something which was agreed upon and has been, this subject has been part of the debate really since the Camp David talks of 2000. And of course there was no agreement reached.
Maysoon Rice, in your opinion, why was the Israeli government outraged at the announcement of the April the 23rd deal between Fatah and Hamas, this whole rapprochement, which was referred to as a surprise deal, while other journalists like Demi Ryder wrote in the New Statesman that the deal actually helped the Israeli government maintain its unity, with the center becoming absolved from pressuring for peace talks. Do you agree with the writer that
Well, I actually agree with Richard Falk, the United Nations rapporteur, who said that he's frankly quite shocked that the Israelis are kicking up such a storm about Abbas and Hamas joining forces. They should be happy that at long last, which is what they've always been moaning about, that they haven't had a unified partner to deal with. And here we have Abbas and Hamas trying to unify and have one voice for the Palestinians. But, the Israelis don't like that. The Americans don't like that. The British don't like that. I mean, it's just ludicrous. We can't win either way. We just cannot win either way. And everybody goes on and on about Israel's security. I mean, for heaven's sake, Israel is a nuclear state. Israel has never defined its borders. Since 1948, it has refused to define its borders. The Israeli flag shows the Nile and the Euphrates. Those are the boundaries for a future Israeli state. And what they want is they want to create tiny little autonomous Bandustan little states within what they call Israel, so that they can rule the Palestinians. The Palestinians, if the Israelis did agree, because I am very against a two-state solution.
Why?
Under Israeli auspices. The Israelis will never give us proper boundaries. The Israelis will control our air, they will control our land boundaries, they will control our naval boundaries, they will not allow Palestinians to have an army. You can just go on and on and on. There's no reality here. I'm sorry, I'm one of these people who strongly believe that the Israelis do not want peace.
Based on what?
The only peace that they understand is taking the rest of Palestine piece by piece. They want to incorporate their so-called Judea and Samaria. And they will not stop until they get that. And John Kerry and the United States, who are not honest brokers in this at all.
Could you elaborate why?
They are all avowed Zionists. They are not going to go against Israel.
So you mean that their ideological beliefs will be in the way?
They have Zionist ideologies. They are not going to agree to this. And even Richard Falk, in a recent article, stated that the American government can never be an honest broker, because on a daily basis all you hear from the American government officials is how much they love Israel, how much they want to protect Israel's security, etc., etc., etc. You can't have it both ways. America will never be an honest broker in the Palestinian issue.
Because of their strong alliance.
Because of their Zionist alliance, and also because of the extremely staunch, strong influence of AIPAC and JINSA and all these other, if you don't mind me saying, Zionist Jewish lobbies within the United States.
Simon, I mean, if you don't mind me saying, there's a few things that I think are important to kind of recognise and make clear. In terms of the Israeli flag, the two blue lines do not represent the Nile and the Euphrates. They represent the Talit, the prayer shawl. It was deliberately discussed, thought about when the Zionists were defining and thinking about what the flag should be, to make a symbol which is identifiable across world Jewry, and not just the Jews of Palestine. Now, a couple of other things which I think are important. Something which I certainly agree with you about is the United States is not an honest broker.
Why do you agree on that one?
It is not an honest broker. And but I think it's important to add this. This is what makes the United States so important for the peace process. So if you look back at when the start of the peace process occurred in the late 1970s with Anwar Sadat and these different strategies, the reason why he wanted US mediation is he looked at the cards, he looked at the map of the Middle East, saw that Israel was being backed by the United States, was in occupation of the Sinai, and his logic was, the only way you can get Israel to make any kind of withdrawal, territorial withdrawal, was through the United States. And it's the United States' close relationship with Israel which would bring Israel into peace talks and to make such concessions. This is the same logic that then drove the PLO to recognize Israel in Resolution 242 in the late 1980s. This is the same logic that brought home the Oslo Accords. Now, the problem, what's happening now, is not a question of whether the United States is an honest broker. The question is, can the United States deliver Israel, push Israel to make these concessions?
What's the answer?
At the moment, my fear is that perhaps it cannot. It's tried many different attempts to make Israel, stop settlement growth and things like that, and hasn't been able to. And because of that, it's really jeopardizes the United States' position in brokering peace. So I think that's certainly important to say. In terms of Israeli security, you may like it, you may dislike it, you may think that it's irrational, you may think it's rational, but Israel is driven by security concerns. And if you want to know what it is that the Israelis want from a peace agreement, it's very simple. It's a big period, a full stop. They want an end of conflict agreement. Now the problem is, what is the basis of the end of conflict agreement? It's not a greater Israel anymore, because we're talking about the Likud government under Netanyahu conceding 90% of Greater Israel. So that's not what they want. What they want are the key areas of the West Bank. Most importantly, East Jerusalem and the access roads into Jerusalem. Okay, and I would really kind of argue this is not a question of Israeli ambitions for Judea and Samaria anymore. It's about who controls East Jerusalem. And Netanyahu does not want to be the prime minister who goes down in history having lost East Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm. First of all, Palestinians will never allow Israel to have Jerusalem as the capital. As a Palestinian, I believe in a one-state solution. I don't believe that it should be done under Israeli auspices. I want a country, a nation, where we have Palestinians, where we have Christians, Arabs and Jews living together, allowed to practice their religions freely, with no intimidation, no insults, as is occurring in Jerusalem at the moment, where you have certain Jewish elements, your fundamentalist elements, like the yeshiva students, who are, and this is fact, this is not something I've made up. You have rabbis teaching yeshiva students to spit on Christian priests. This is unacceptable. You have the Israelis stopping Muslims going to pray at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. You have the foundations of the Al-Aqsa Mosque being jeopardized because these fundamentalist Jews want to revive their Solomon temple, which they believe is under the Al-Aqsa Mosque. We Palestinians are craving for peace. We are tired. We are tired of our people dying. We are tired of our people being arrested every single day by Israeli forces. We are tired of the 10,000 Palestinians rotting in Israeli jails, where they are being sodomized, where they are being raped, where they're being tortured. And there's enough evidence from Amnesty International and other human rights organizations to back me up on this. I'm not just coming out with it, through my head. These are facts. You have over 250 children in Israeli jails. UNICEF just issued a report about the mistreatment of Palestinian children in Israeli jails. I want peace for my people. I want what used to be Palestine, where before the ugly beast of Zionism entered into the equation, we Arabs, Christian, Muslim and Jew lived peacefully together. That's what I want for my Palestine.
Do you think, Maysoon, that this security concern from the Arab world, especially not just the Palestinians, is extended in a way, or maybe revealed, especially with the Palestinians, because of the Israeli frustration of what is happening in the Middle East, especially with Iran, with Hezbollah around the border. But do you think that the Palestinians are the weakest link there, and Israel is manifesting its power basically with them mostly? That's why they are ending up being frustrated as well.
You know, I find it extremely unbelievable how, you know, people put through the same argument that, you know, poor little Israel is surrounded by these barbaric Arabs who want to wipe Israel off the face of the earth, etc., etc., which isn't true. I have 3 statements: divide and rule. That is our Achilles heel, and that has been deliberately manipulated and used by the West to weaken Arab rulers. The majority of the Arab rulers that we have been installed by the West to serve the West, and they do not serve the Arab people, they do not serve the Palestinian people. It's amazing how you know, people always describe this wall that is obscenely separating what is left of Palestine. You have the nerve to describe it as a fence.
I call it both a barrier.
It's not a barrier, and it is not a fence. It is 70 feet high, 80 meters high, and its entire length is 626 to 788 kilometers.
I mean,
that is not a normal fence. Israel is a nuclear state. Israel is armed to the teeth with state-of-the-art weapons of mass destruction from the United States, paid for by the United States taxpayers. So please, don't try and fool everybody by telling us, you know, poor little Israel is surrounded by these barbaric Arabs threatening to wipe Israel. We are not. It's divide and rule, and you, the West, have installed all these corrupt leaders.
I never described Israel as a little Israel being attacked by surrounding Arab states. That's I think, really the logic of a bygone era. Maybe that was arguable in 1948, 1949, perhaps even up to 67. Certainly isn't now. As you said, it's a nuclear state, so its security is never really in jeopardy in terms of the existence and the continuation of the state of Israel. So certainly. But in terms of the barrier, it is what it is. In certain points, it's a fence. When it enters and when it goes through urban populations in Palestinian towns and cities, it becomes a very, very, very fortified and high wall. It is both a wall and a fence. And the root of it, in my opinion, is reprehensible. It should be on the 1967 lines after an agreement. But nevertheless, it is, in certain parts, in certain areas, a wall. In other parts, it's a fence.
What is next when it comes to the Israeli and Palestinian peace talks?
Okay, well, I think for the next 6 months, there's not going to be too much movement. The United States, the broker for any kind of peace agreement, is going back to Washington, going to regroup, rethink what it can do. Meanwhile, I think it needs to wait and see. We need to wait and see what happens in terms of any kind of Palestinian reconciliation agreement. And then after that, after elections, if they happen, then we're talking about perhaps some kind of new momentum for peace talks to continue. But again, that's not going to happen, I think, until at least 6 months from now, maybe longer.
And my final question to Maysoon Rice, as a Palestinian who is known for her activism, where do you see all this going, and how would Palestinians, or perhaps you personally, want things to pan out ideally?
I want the Israelis to be honest. They are not honest. I want the Israelis to stop influencing American foreign policies. I want the United States to stop using taxpayers' money to fund Israel that receives billions of dollars from American taxpayers. I want peace for my people, but I will give you a quote from a former German foreign minister, Fischer, who said, and I concur, he sees no such hope currently that exists for peace in the Middle East. And I agree with him. I don't know. You see, we've had this talk between Hamas and Fatah so many times, but this time the rope has to stay firm. We can't afford for it to be broken. It has to stay firm.
This interesting and many times sensitive discussion will have to come to an end today due to time constraints. Once again, I would like to thank our guests over the phone. We had Jonathan Fryer and we also had Dr. Imad Karam. And via Skype from Jerusalem, we had Dr. Toby Green. And with me at the studio, Maysoon Rice, thank you very much for coming, and Dr. Simon Waldman of King's College. Thank you very much to both of you for being on Straightforward. And I'll be with you again soon, and bye for now.
Arafat. The Abbas-Dahlan dispute highlights the chaos and bitter succession crisis in Fatah, and it threatens to further deteriorate the movement's public image and alienate Palestinian public opinion. The escalating dispute has led to what appears to be a bitter succession crisis. Fatah has had plenty of factional disputes in the past, but the current one has been the most damaging given its timing and the high profile of the parties involved. Fatah is scheduled to hold its 7th General Conference in August to select a new leadership, but fragmentation at both the leadership and grassroots levels threatens to make the coming month increasingly turbulent. The movement's predicament is bound to intensify in the coming weeks now that there is a deadlock in the Israeli-Palestinian peace talks. It appears that Hamas has begun a tentative rapprochement with Dahlan to reduce the siege on Gaza from the Egyptian side, as Dahlan is considered close to the military regime in Egypt. Dahlan is said to have influence in Palestinian refugee camps and Jordan and Lebanon, and among the governments of the United Arab Emirates. There have been reports of meetings between Field Marshal Abdel Fattah al-Sisi and Dahlan, with Sisi attempting to facilitate Dahlan's readmission into Fatah. But how important are the Abbas-Mish'al talks in Doha, and would they be a roadmap that would strengthen the Palestinian Authority?
And now let's talk to Jonathan Fryer, journalist and lecturer at SOAS. Thank you very much for being on Straightforward.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Jonathan, could we relate the Doha talks between Khalid Mish'al and President Mahmoud Abbas to what is happening in Egypt? There have been reports of meetings between presidential candidate Field Marshal Abdel Fattah al-Sisi,
which basically was saying Israel needs to get back to talks with the Palestinians, because the longer it goes on, the longer the difficulty goes on, the longer settlements are built, then the further away peace will be.
Mm-hmm. Do you think a stop in expansion when it comes to the settlements, particularly in the West Bank, would help any possible peace talks in the near future if Israel decided to stop settlements?
It would certainly help. I think it's a tragic miscalculation by Benjamin Netanyahu not to have halted the settlements already, despite being urged to do so not only by the Europeans but by President Barack Obama as well. I think the Americans are starting to lose a little patience with the Israelis, understandably and correctly, and the only way really that the Israelis could regain a little initiative would be to stop the settlements, but alas, there has been no sign whatsoever. They're still announcing new settlements.
What do you think of John Kerry's phraseology when he mentioned Israel risks becoming an apartheid state?
I think he was very brave to say it, and when he was talking about the risk of apartheid, because in the American context, given the strength of the pro-Israeli lobby in America, it was a very brave thing to say. Unfortunately, he then had to retract it, or felt he had to retract it, which was a shame, because it was a good, really an attempt to get the American public as well as the Israelis themselves, to understand the dangers that they're heading towards.
And Mohammed Dahlan, for instance, the former head of the Palestinian Authority Preventive Security Service in the Gaza Strip, he met with Sisi attempting to facilitate his readmission into Fatah. So do you relate these events?
Well, I think they're all part of a quite interesting, almost ballet that's happening in the Middle East and the region at the moment, consequent on the decision by Fatah and Hamas to come together. And obviously, although that has put the wind up the Israelis, nonetheless, it's caused other partners in the region, including the Qataris and the Egyptians and others, to see that actually things are possibly moving in an interesting direction, and they want to be involved.
Yes. And my other question, Jonathan Fryer, would be, what do you have to say about the Kerry Initiative, and why do you think it didn't really yield its desired objectives?
Well, obviously the main problem there was that they didn't have in the Israelis a partner who was really able and willing to make sufficient step forward. That's why John Kerry was so frustrated about the outcome, of course, and why the European countries, including Britain, have been, for the main part, expressing deep disappointment. And it was interesting that, for example, at the meeting of the European Liberal parties in Vienna the other day, a motion was passed.
Welcome back to Straightforward, Levant TV's political debate show looking into the Middle East top issues and assessing them objectively by having guests representing all views. Today's topic is the Kerry Initiative and the alternative route to pursuing Israeli-Palestinian peace talks vis-à-vis the Fatah-Hamas rapprochement. With me at the studio this evening is UK-based activist and blogger Maysoon Rice. Thank you very much for being on Straightforward. And also with me is Dr. Simon Waldman, lecturer in Middle East politics at King's College London. Thank you very much for coming. We will be joined later by the phone by Dr. Imad Karam, head of IR at Initiatives Change UK, and Dr. Toby Green, director of research at BICOM Britain-Israel Communications and Research Centre, and by SOAS lecturer and journalist Jonathan Fryer. But before we start our first part on US brokered peace efforts, let's have a bit of background through this brief report.
Last March the 10th, the Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas gave a speech broadcast on state TV to the 120 members of Fatah's Revolutionary Council. Abbas devoted about half of his 2-hour speech to accusations against Mohammed Dahlan, the former head of the Palestinian Authority Preventive Security Service in the Gaza Strip. Abbas accused Dahlan of corruption, assassinations, and treasonous collaboration with Israel. Abbas even hinted that Dahlan may have played a role in the death of Yasser.
Thank you very much. That was Jonathan Fryer, journalist and lecturer at SOAS in London. Thank you very much indeed for your prompt participation.
Thank you.
And now I will ask Dr. Waldman, in your opinion, could the talks between President Abbas and Fatah leader Khalid Mish'al pave the way to a roadmap that the Palestinian leadership could take now that the Kerry Initiative did not really yield too much?
Well, I mean, that is the big question at the moment. From what's happened in the past and previous agreements, one should not be too optimistic. What's interesting about the idea of a kind of a reconciliation in Palestinian politics is this is very popular. If you ask a Palestinian what they want, probably number one would be an end of the occupation. Probably number two would be some kind of unity within the Palestinian factions. And the lack of unity is one of the problems which has plagued the Palestinian population, right
maybe
from the 1920s.
Arab population in general.
You could even say perhaps the Arab population in general. This particular one, it's interesting in that how does it relate to the peace process? How does it work on the ground? Well, I'm yet to see really the nitty-gritty of the terms come out, but it seems to be along the lines of creating some kind of interim technocratic government to really caretake for 6 months until elections come out. So I think the real question is, if this is successful, what would be the outcome of elections? And from there we can analyse what future for the peace process. But this is, of course, a big if. I mean, you know.